Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Illuminos Less Stress Parenting webinar series. Today, we have on Dr. Sarah Wayland from Guiding Exceptional Parents, and she's going to talk to us about the myths of students with learning differences. We really hope that you enjoy the program. She's an expert in her field. She comes with quite the resume, including not only where she went to school at multiple very strong educational centers, but also because she works with a plethora of different types of kids, and she helps with a variety of different things. So she does relationship intervention, parent-child journey, collaborative and proactive solutions. She does a program called Peers, and she really is a leader in her field. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Wayland, and I hope you all enjoy the program today.
Okay. So hello, I'm very pleased to be here. Wendy, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to race through a large number of slides. There were a lot of things to cover, and so one of the things you're going to learn is that I'm only going to touch on some of the myths about students with learning differences, because I was doing some research as I was preparing for the talk and discovered there are lots and lots of myths about students with learning differences. So I'm mostly going to focus today on myths about their behaviors. So we'll dive in. What is behavior? So one of the things I want to start with is just saying there's no such thing as good behavior or bad behavior, okay? It's really whether your kid is regulated or dysregulated. So when a kid is regulated, they feel good and they're able to meet the expectations that you have for them or their expectations for themselves. If they're dysregulated, you might see challenging behaviors, and types of dysregulation might include a kid who's anxious or angry, aggressive, may refuse to do things, be oppositional, and so on. They may be defiant, or avoid doing what they need to do, or they may be having sensory struggles. So there's lots of different ways that dysregulation can play out. So I would love it if everybody who was here stopped calling kids good or bad, but instead focused on whether they're regulated or dysregulated. So to explain what I mean by dysregulation, I'm going to talk about the rumble rage cycle, but in the context of talking about three different brain systems. Now, in 1960, Paul MacLean talked about lizard brain, mammalian brain, and then human brains. However, it turns out that as we learn more about lizards, it turns out that all animals have a survival component and a limbic system type thing, and also a cortex, which is where thinking happens. And so I prefer to talk about networks as opposed to areas of the brain. So there's a survival network that keeps us alive. We are on autopilot when we are just trying to stay alive. This is when you're scared out of your mind and you're either fighting with whatever's attacking you or running away from it, or freezing because you realize that bad things are imminent. The second type of brain system that we'll be talking about here is your emotional brain. So it's your ability to process emotions. This system is where emotions, memories, and habits are. And it's also responsible for instinctually based decisions. So decisions that you've learned to do over time. Maybe your route driving to a familiar place. It's a habit, right? Often you will get in your car and get going, and then you'll arrive wherever it is you're going and not even remember how you got there. That's sort of an instinctually based system. It's a memory of how to get there. Certainly not a survival part of the brain. It's definitely a well-learned part of your brain. And then there's the thinking brain, which people usually talk about the gray matter or the neocortex. And this is where complex thinking happens. So ability to process language, to imagine past or future events, to think about abstract things like love or justice. And then consciousness, just being aware that you are thinking and that you are, processing hard things. This is where reasoning and rational thought happen. So what I wanted to talk about here is the rumble rage cycle. And pretty much anyone who's ever heard me talk has probably heard me talk about the rumble rage cycle. So what you want to think about with this, this graph here is how dysregulated your kid is. So more dysregulated is up at the top, more regulated is down at the bottom. And then across the x-axis here, that's time. So what happens is you're going along and everything's great. And all three areas of your brain are working together. They're keeping you alive. They're pulling up memories when you need them. They're helping you think about unique situations that are coming up, and you're calm and regulated. And then something happens. So some event happens, and you start feeling a little bit uncomfortable or uneasy. Maybe there's a detour on your route to work or something like that, so you're getting a little worried. And then there's another detour and another detour. And if you cannot figure your way out of the situation you're in, or a different solution or something like that, you're going to get more and more dysregulated, and eventually you'll lose your ability to think clearly. So when you're regulated, all three parts of your brain are online. When you start rumbling, your cortex may go offline. And so you're really relying on instincts and other people to help you. And then if you can't address that and get back to being regulated, then even the emotion processing part goes offline, and you slip into just the survival brain. So survival brain is where, it's fight, flight, or freeze, right? And Brenda Smith-Miles, when she first proposed the rumble rage cycle, called that the rage. And remember, you can't process language when you're there. You can't really actually hear very much of what people are saying to you. You certainly are not capable of rational thought. And if nothing keeps triggering you, eventually you start calming down and you shift into recovery as your emotional brain comes back online. And when you have a kid who shifts into recovery, some kids are very ashamed of what happened during the rage. And so they may want comforting and reassurance that you still like them, even though they did things they are embarrassed about, or they may want to hide because they're so upset or just trying to get themselves together. And if, like I said, if you can avoid re-triggering anything, then eventually the cortex will come back online, and then you'll have this regulated, teachable way of being. So Dan Siegel likes to talk about the hand model of the brain. So what you can see here is a hand, and that's like the brain with all the parts working together. And then you flip your lid, right? So your cortex goes offline. Thumb represents the emotional part of the brain. And when that goes offline, you're left with the hindbrain. So that's, like the wrist and so on. So he talks about the fact that, you flip your lid, your emotional system goes offline, and then you're left with survival brain. And then those things come back online. So it's a nice way for kids to remember this, but also for grownups. So what works during each of those? What can you ask of a kid when they're in each of those phases? So if they're in a regulated, teachable phase, then you can ask them to think. You can ask them to talk to you. You can ask them what they would do, and so on. When they're rumbling, because their ability to think and process language has gone offline, and they're really only operating on an emotional and well-learned memory way of processing the world, really the only thing that works is comforting them. And you, as the person outside, using your own frontal cortex and gray matter to solve the problem and help, and hopefully address what's going on before things get so out of control that the kid trips into fight, flight, or freeze, in which case really all you can do is just keep everyone safe. But it's really important to remember, don't talk during, like once they start rumbling, saying, okay, use your strategies, that's not going to work because by that time they've gotten dysregulated enough that they're not able to implement those strategies. Once you're in the rage, you just have to wait And when you get into recovery, sometimes comforting works. Some kids need comforting. Sometimes you need to just leave them alone and listen to what your kid says. So if your kid says, go away, you should go away. And then eventually that cortex comes back online and you'll have this regulated, teachable moment. So what are some signs that kids have when their nervous system is dysregulated? The first one, so here you just have some kids are angry, right? Some kids are very flat. So that's kind of, freeze-ish, right? Or their anger may be way, way, way more intense than you think is the situation warrants. Whoops. I'm going to see if I can move the mouse without advancing the slides. Some kids feel numb. So this is a sign that your system is starting to get dysregulated. They might feel disconnected or dissociated from the situation. They might have very low energy. So their anxiety may have shut their body down. They may look depressed and things like that. Some kids respond to being in these things, trouble getting started, resisting what you're asking them to do, procrastinating on a task that they know they need to do. These are all signs that their nervous system is dysregulated. Lack of confidence, trouble focusing, having racing thoughts, difficulty sleeping, maybe sleeping too much or not being able to fall asleep at all. And then there's, of course, burnout, exhaustion, and overwhelm, which is something that happens when kids are dysregulated over time. Their bodies can't process it anymore. So I love what Ross Greene says about behavior. He says, challenging behavior is just a signal, the fever, the means by which the kid is communicating that he or she is having difficulty meeting an expectation. So the way my friend Penny and I like to say it is, your child is not giving you a hard time. Your child is having a hard time. If you can keep this framework in mind, then it will help you support your child through these difficult moments much more effectively. All right, so now I want to dive into another myth, which parents of kids who are having trouble in school often hear, which is that kids behave poorly because of bad parenting. So one of the things you just heard me talking about is the fact that it's not parenting, it's that your kid is having a hard time. So very often what I find is kids who have challenging behaviors will, my favorite one is when the teacher calls parents from school and says, your child is misbehaving, you need to, get them under control. And the parents are like, I'm not in the classroom right now and I'm not at school. There's not a lot I can do from here. And even talking to them, because like I said, if their thinking brain has gone offline, your kid isn't going to remember what you said to them the night before. So the onus is really on the people who are actually present in the situation to provide calming, regulating strategies for the kid. So the way I like to think about this, and this is following on Ross Greene, is that behavior is a symptom of underlying challenges. It is not a sign of bad parenting. So one thing I wanted to talk about was the idea of can't versus won't. So let's say your kid has to do a writing assignment. So one that my younger son used to have a lot of trouble with were things called brief constructed responses. He used to get really, really angry at brief constructed responses. And in fact, we had to white out BCR at the top of the page if he was given them because he used to get so mad at them. And the problem was he really couldn't do a brief constructed response. A, he had trouble with handwriting. B, he didn't know how to get the thoughts from his head out, into a word he could write. C, he had trouble spelling. So there were a lot of things getting in his way and making it hard for him to do a simple writing assignment, like writing a couple of sentences about a topic. That was a can't. Certainly he wasn't doing it. But if you had asked him to do it, he wouldn't have been able to come up with the words. He would have had a really hard time writing the words because of his dysgraphia. So for him, This was a matter of skill. It wasn't a matter of will. He wasn't being a meanie to his teacher because he, didn't want to do it for her. It was because he literally could not do it. So one of the things that I would love to see the world change in is to focus instead on looking for the trigger for the behavior, as opposed to focusing on the behavior itself. So what triggers a behavior? What causes and conditions lead to the behavior? So the example I just gave you about my son is that he was asked to write, right? So that was the antecedent. People talk about the ABCs of behavior. So he's asked to write, then he has the behavior, which in his case was throwing his pencil or running away or ducking under his desk. So that was avoidance, right? And then he got sent to the principal's office, and the consequence was he didn't have to write, and he loved that. So the next time he was asked to write, then he's like, great, I'm going to fling my pencil again, because then I get sent to the principal's office and I don't have to write. So this is an example of a behavior that had an antecedent and a consequence. And you have to think about all of these things when you're thinking about why a kid is doing what they're doing. So there are many possible triggers. I was focusing in that example on skill, right? So that's on ability to do a task, right? But there are other things that can lead to difficulties doing a task. Biology. So what if your kid is getting a cold or the flu or, COVID, who knows? Like, what if they're getting some kind of thing that is making their body feel bad? Well, guess what? It's hard to do things when you don't feel good. I had a client whose son was having a really hard time staying awake in class because he was falling asleep because he was sick. And the school had told her, he had been out with the flu for 2 weeks, and the school had told her he has to come in. They were very worried about attendance, and they wanted him to come in. He wasn't feeling well. And then they were upset because his head was on the table. So he was exhausted. That was a won't, right? But it was a won't because he didn't feel good. That's biology, right? Could be the environment is difficult for the kids. So some kids, for example, are sensitive to fluorescent lights. I have a friend who has to wear a baseball cap in a classroom because the flickering of the fluorescent lights is very difficult for him. And so he always wears his baseball cap with a dark underside of the rim. Maybe it's too loud. Maybe it's distracting. Maybe the kid doesn't like the feeling of a pen scritching on the paper or a pencil scritching on the paper. There can be all sorts of things contributing to the environment. Maybe the kid sitting next to you is teasing you and making you feel bad, right? There are all sorts of things going on. We talked about ability. There's also disconnection. So if a kid really doesn't like a teacher or doesn't, really like you at that moment, they may not want to do what you ask them to do. A lot of times kids will overcome their difficulty doing a task because they like the person who is asking them to do it and they want to make that person happy. If they don't want to make you happy, they may not want to do it. And that's something I don't hear people talking about a lot, but it's real. It's very real. And the last one people also don't talk about a whole lot is no sense of agency. So when we tell our kids what to do all the time and they don't understand why it's important, then they feel like they're just doing things and they don't know what the purpose of it is. And also they feel like they can't say, hey, I'd rather do this a different way. Always having to do things that other people tell you what to do and not having agency in it can really be hard for a lot of kids. And one way to deal with that is, maybe you want to learn how to write a brief constructed response, but make it be on a topic that you choose as opposed to one that's chosen by somebody else. That's a way to give a kid a sense of agency in that situation. So one of the things you just heard is there can be all these different reasons for why a kid might be behaving a particular way. And the key to improving that behavior is really understanding what is going on for your kid. It's well beyond the scope of this presentation, but Dan Shapiro actually teaches a class called Parent-Child Journey that has a really good questionnaire as part of the program called the Gander, and that can really help you get at, what's going on for your kid. So I recommend that highly. It's on his website, parentchildjourney.com. So another myth I wanted to address, kids behave badly because they want attention. I hear teachers say things like this, and I hear parents say things like this too. I was talking to a parent yesterday, and her daughter was very upset about something, and she went to the bathroom to cry. And a teacher came in and said she'd been in the bathroom too long and she needed to go back to the class. Kid was still crying. So she actually has a hall pass that says she can go out if she's having a hard time. Girl went outside and was bawling her eyes out outside. And one of the administrators came by and told her that she was doing it to get attention. She was by herself outside, bawling her eyes out. I don't think she was trying to get attention. I think she needed to get herself together and was trying to do it away from other people, and then they weren't letting her. She did not want attention. She wanted to feel better. So this gets to another way I like thinking about behavior, which is using what I call a brain-based lens. We got this from Eileen Devine, I believe, and she talks about the fact that sometimes people use what she calls a brain-based lens, which is sort of the biology of behavior or brain-based reasons why kids are behaving the way they are, versus a behavior-based lens. In her mind, the behavior-based lens is about will and won't, whereas brain-based lens is about can't and skill. So a behavior lens, if you have a kid who's doing these kinds of things, acting frustrated, lashing out, yelling, being mad, being just super intense, not listening, disengaged, very emotional, not responsive or sad, the behavior-based lens would say that this kid is being bad. They have poor character. They're lazy, disrespectful. They don't care. They choose not to do something. They're being defiant or unmotivated. That's a behavior-based lens. It's focused on what you think the behavior is about. But if you see a child through a brain-based lens, you might think, oh, they have lagging skills. Their handwriting looks bad. Maybe their autonomic nervous system is triggered, and that's that fight, flight, or freeze response I was talking about. Maybe they have poor frustration tolerance, or the sensory world is completely dysregulating to them right now. They feel misunderstood. What you're asking of them is just not doable. Maybe they're a little younger than other kids. So for example, kids with ADHD, people usually talk about a delay in maturity by about a third. Some people say it's 2 to 3 years, others say it's a third of their age. And then maybe they're just feeling emotionally dysregulated. These things can all lead to these kinds of behaviors, but the way you interpret what you're seeing feels really different. Okay, another myth I hear all the time, that kid is refusing to work because they are lazy. Whoops. See, I'm having, all right. Okay, they say kids are refusing to work because they are lazy. So using that behavior-based lens, then you might think, my child isn't getting his science project done because he's lazy. He needs to stop being so lazy. His lack of motivation is going to be a huge problem when he's an adult in the real world. So this is, something that people say when kids are not doing something that's really important for them to do for school. But through the brain-based lens, you might instead think, my child isn't getting a science project done because he has poor executive functioning. And in particular, he has trouble with time management. Maybe he thinks he can do the whole project, in a couple of hours, and doesn't realize he needs to do a lot of planning and, doing little bits day by day. He needs help with this. building these skills now, teaching him how to break these skills down, will help him in the future. So that's an example of a brain-based lens versus a behavior-based lens. Okay, here's another myth I love. Kids don't look at you when you're talking because they don't respect you. So there's a whole lot of reasons a kid might not look at you. One of my kids is deaf in one ear, so he's going to point the ear he can hear at you, but that means he's not looking at you. He also is autistic, so he says that looking at people's eyes actually is very distressing for him. It's not distressing. He says it's just distracting. And he basically says, I can either look at you or I can listen to you, but I can't do both. So actually, he's respecting you by looking and pointing the ear he can hear with at you. Kids also don't look at you, maybe because they're anxious. I first learned about this from Rick Lavoie. He had this workshop he did back in the 70s called the Frustration, Anxiety, and Tension Workshop. He actually called it Fat City, Frustration, Anxiety, and Tension. And he had this thing where he had this teacher trying to read a piece of paper that was organized the way it might look for a kid who has trouble with vision and maybe dyslexia. And he was asking this teacher to read it. She couldn't read it. And he started saying, come on, this is easy. You know, what's wrong with you? And she was getting more and more nervous and upset. And she was looking down. And so he said, notice she's looking down. She's looking away. And if I say, look at me while you're doing this, you know, why are you looking away? You're being disrespectful. It was really powerful. And since then, I've noticed that when people are anxious, they cannot look at you. So when somebody's not looking at you, it's not necessarily a lack of respect. It's probably something else. Another myth, kids don't turn in their homework because they don't care. I actually heard somebody giving a talk on executive functioning, and he was saying that this was the thing that convinced him that executive dysfunction was actually a disability, because the kids would do the homework and then they would forget to turn it in. So they were basically sabotaging themselves. There are a lot of kids who do that. Now, there are some kids who don't do the homework because they don't know how, but it's often because of difficulties with executive functioning, as the example I gave previously showed. So those are a few of the myths that I pulled out just about behavior that I just wanted to push back on a little bit. So then the question is, what do you do? So remember, I talked about these different areas where you want to address the underlying problem. Don't send your kids to school sick, right? And schools, if kids are sick, don't make them come in. You're just getting everybody else sick anyway. But also don't make them make up the work necessarily when they get back, because they're recovering from being sick. I wish that was policy. It's not. So anyway, as far as environment goes, like think about things in the environment that might be hard for the kid, or think about ability. This is the kind of thing that Illuminos can really help with, is these ability issues, like helping you learn how to write, helping you learn how to break big projects down into smaller tasks. So, you know, a tutor is really helpful for these ability kinds of issues. Disconnection, figure out how to let that kid know you actually like them. Oops. And oh boy, I've done it again. Okay. How to get that kid to understand that you actually like and care about them and want them to do well, and that's why you're asking them to do these things. That's really helpful, building a relationship with the kid. And like I said, giving them a little bit of a sense of agency. Another thing I just wanted to address briefly is how to teach. So this is a little discussion on the difference between accommodation and teaching and how that process works, because I find sometimes people are a little unrealistic about how they think learning a new skill goes. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the child's performance over time. Just like grown-ups, kids have good days and kids have bad days. So their performance on a given task on some days is going to be good, and on some days it's going to be bad. And you'll see this variation over time, that some days are good and some days are bad. That's just normal. And you as adult, you have that too. So when we as an adult have an expectation that a child will perform at a certain level. We can understand that things can be good and bad. But if our kid can't do that, then we might adjust our expectations to be closer to being in line with what that child's ability is, right? And that's what we mean by accommodation. And when you do that, everything is calm, right? As opposed to when your expectations are way up here and there's just no way the child is ever going to meet those. So that's awesome, except the kid's not learning. So how do you get them to learn? The answer is you want to challenge them what is called a just right amount, a just noticeable difference. Lev Vygotsky, as you can see, this is pretty old. Most teachers know about Vygotsky, and Vygotsky likes to talk about something called the zone of proximal development, which is something a kid can do, but with guidance. Okay, so there are some things kids can do without any help. Sleeping, eating, once they're in middle school, I mean, walking. These are things that most of us do without even thinking twice about it. Then there are things that people cannot do. For me, that would be turning a cartwheel, right? So no matter how much you told me I needed to turn a cartwheel, I really couldn't turn a cartwheel. But in the zone of proximal development, there might be something that a kid could do, but with guidance. Maybe a somersault is something they could do with guidance as opposed to a full-on cartwheel, right? And so this is something that's hard, but doable, right? So that's what you want to do, is you want to challenge your kid that just right amount. So if the kid's ability is here, maybe you make a demand that's just a little bit above what they can do, right? And over time, they get better and better, and they have good days and bad days. So sometimes people say, I know they can do it. They did it the other day. And it might be that that's a bad day and they can't do it that day. But over time, if you keep having this just right amount of challenge for them, they keep learning, you keep adjusting, and over time, they learn the skill and meet the expectation. So that's usually what schools will do is they'll accommodate while the child is learning. And then once the child has learned the skill, then they can remove the accommodation. So that just right challenge is something that is really, really helpful for kids. The other thing you might want to do is foster a growth mindset. So I think most of us know what a growth mindset is. But just to remind you, a growth mindset really views failure on a task as an opportunity to grow and learn. A lot of kids think they're supposed to be perfect all the time. And so they think failure is the limit of their abilities. So if you can't do a math problem, it's because you're stupid, as opposed to that I don't know how to do that kind of math problem and I just need to learn how. So there are things you can do, language you can use when you're working with a kid that can help them adopt a growth mindset. I can learn to do anything I want. Challenges help me grow. My effort and attitude determine my abilities to some extent. I'll never be able to do a cartwheel, by the way. Feedback is constructive. It's helping me. It's not designed to criticize me. I'm inspired by the success of others, and I like to try new things. The fixed mindset, these kinds of things, you'll hear people say these things like, oh, I just give up, or, well, I'm not good at that, so I can't do it. So this is something that a lot of kids really think that they're just supposed to know everything. And when they don't quite know how to process that. So be mindful of the language you use with them to promote a growth mindset. So that's it. And I guess we're going to turn it over for questions. And Wendy, I'm not quite sure how you want to do this.
No, yeah, we can absolutely turn it over for questions. If everybody can put any questions that they have, either raise your hand or add it to the Q&A. We can try to answer your questions with the time that we have left. So we can give it a minute to go through those. And Sarah, while we're waiting, why don't you share with us exactly about the roles that you actually have with in your business with guiding exceptional parents? You wear a number of hats, and maybe you can explain what each role is so that folks who need support can understand how you can help them.
Yeah, I've got 3 roles. So the first one is something I call special needs care navigator. And what that is usually I'll meet with a family and we'll just talk about what's going on for their kid. Usually they're stressed out about something. And so we'll talk about what's stressing them out. And I'll recommend a way to address the problem. So sometimes I have people, I actually teach a section of Dan Shapiro's parent-child journey class. And very often we get to the end of the class and the very last class is, okay, you've tried all these awesome parenting strategies and something's still up. What do you do now? And so one of the things I will do with families is, look at the kid's profile, talk about what's hard for them. Maybe I'll recommend an assessment either through the school or privately. And then after they get the assessment and we know what's going on for that kid, then I'll recommend, tutors or therapists, things like that, people who can help with the specific challenges that the person is dealing with. And I work with parents who have kids with dyslexia, dysgraphia, autism, ADHD, mood disorders, all sorts of different kinds of things. So that is one thing. And I'm going to switch to answering questions. So do you want me to read it or do you want to read it?
Up to you. Either way, go ahead.
Okay. So Barbara wrote, how do you engage in a conversation with children or adolescents when they are stressed or simply in their teenager years and not very responsive? Yes, this is a big problem for teens. So if you want to talk to them about their purpose or pathways they wish to take in the future, these are hard conversations, Barbara, and teens are very stressed out about them, right? Because part of what they're doing is trying to figure out who they are, right? They're trying to figure out, who am I? What am I going to do? They're trying on lots of different ways of being and seeing how that feels for them. And sometimes those ways of being aren't necessarily what you as a parent enjoy watching in them. But one of the things I found with that particular question is in little tiny bits, like you'll just throw something out at one point and maybe they respond and maybe they don't. I remember when I was in high school, my dad, I think I was in 10th grade, my dad said, well, you need to think about what you're doing for the future. What do you want to do with your life? It's like, I don't know. I'm in 10th grade. And, but I thought about it long and hard. And after a couple of months, I was like, I think I want to be a psychologist. And here I am. So but it took a couple of months. It wasn't a conversation I was going to have in one round. So one thing I learned from my very wise father, is to just throw little questions out or get your kid thinking about something, but don't expect a response right there in the moment. The second thing is share your own experiences with your kid. So just tell a story from your childhood about you being confused and not knowing what to do, or how you decided you wanted to be a psychologist, if you're me, but things like that. So those are some little tricks that I find helpful. And I do find asking questions often triggers sort of a pushback. So I like to use something called declarative language, where I just make a statement about something. Oh yeah, I remember being in 10th grade and having no clue what I wanted to do. And see how that goes. Sometimes it lands with a thud and sometimes they respond. So those are some thoughts I have. Okay, second person wrote, how do you calm down the crier who gets overwhelmed at the sound of homework? Okay, that's a really tough question. And one thing I would ask about that, Lenora, is what are the underlying reasons behind why they're getting overwhelmed by their homework? Are you asking them to do brief constructed responses? So in my case, the answer was yes. And actually the school gave us an accommodation. We had to do no brief constructed responses at home until my son learned to do it better at school. And then it wasn't so overwhelming at home. So I think getting to the reason for the overwhelm, and there can be a bunch of them. So something I see a lot of is, this is going to take forever. Right. That's when I hear a lot of kids say, oh, it's going to take forever. So, there are strategies you can work on with kids, like, say, okay, estimate how long it's going to take. Forever. Okay, let's sit down and do it. And then you set a timer, and then it takes them 10 minutes to get through it. And so then the next time when they say, oh, it's going to take forever, you say, well, last time it took you 10 minutes. And maybe that will help, and maybe they'll tell you to shut up. So you get all sorts of responses for that. This is actually the kind of thing I think Illuminos tutoring would be really, really helpful with, because they can help you get to the bottom of what is going on for your kid, and they're a trusted adult. Sometimes you as a parent have a relationship with your child where they just don't believe anything you say, and so having a tutor is definitely can be helpful. My kids really got a lot of wisdom from their tutors and various helpers over the years. Okay. Next one says need tools. I'm hoping I just gave you a couple of ideas there. And if you want to clarify any more, then that would be great. I'm going to skip ahead to Aisha, who says, how do we let kids figure out their passion? Is there a certain age? That is such a great question, because some kids just like to dabble, like they'll just like do lots of different things. They never seem to really have a passion. And other kids are just like, from age 5, they know what they want to be. I mean, I'm not kidding you. My older son knew he wanted to program computers from a very, very young age. My second kid, it took him a while. He thought he wanted to be a game designer. He thought he wanted to be a writer, all these things. Now he's decided he wants to be a librarian. And but he went through a lot of different choices. And what I like to do there is to just let your kid explore what's interesting to them, like make it possible for them to do things and expose them to lots of different things so they can explore them. It's perfectly normal to not have a clue what your passion is when you're a kid, and even when you're an adult. We change our minds all the time, and that's part of what makes life fun. So so that is my answer to Aisha. And I'm gonna skip to Jenny, who says, for a child who struggles with writing essays, not short paragraphs, how to help them improve their writing skills. So writing is so complicated. There are so many things that go into writing. Again, this is a case where a good tutor can really, really help you. So things that could get in the way. You might have trouble coming up with the word you want to use. You might have trouble organizing your thinking in a coherent way. You might not have the language. You might not understand what the teacher wants. You might have trouble with the physical act of writing. You might have trouble organizing all the thoughts you have into a coherent structure. So there are all sorts of things that can get in the way of writing, and kids can have lots of different kinds of challenges and especially for a long thing like writing an essay. That's really, really hard. So this is a case where you really do need to deep dive and figure out exactly what's going on for your kid, and which of, and I mentioned a few skills, there are there are more. And so just having somebody who understands all the things that are involved in the writing process, I think can really be helpful. Okay, I hope that answered. Chris says, my middle schooler's penmanship is difficult to read, and he has an accommodation to type assignments. However, there are times when he still needs to write. Yes. Is it worth getting tutoring for penmanship at this point? Nothing we tried in preschool or elementary school stuck. So I refer you to any doctor who has terrible handwriting and somehow has managed to be successful. My husband actually has really, really terrible handwriting. And to be honest with you, he really never writes. So he will scan papers in and fill them out using Adobe Acrobat Professional, because his handwriting is quite illegible. And he has a Ph.D. So he didn't, suffer from it. I'm sure he did, because I'm sure he got no credit for things when people couldn't read it. And that's a problem. My older son, the way he dealt with this issue is that for long assignments and so on, he typed everything, but he set aside 15 minutes every day. And by the way, this was his initiative, set aside 15 minutes every day just to practice handwriting. And that actually turned out to be so helpful. Oh, and Jenny writes that visual therapy helps. This is true. So again, this is a case where just getting to the bottom of what's going on. So some kids, for example, they have difficulty tracking smoothly. And so, and that goes with writing too, right? And also kids will report things like things jump around on the page for them. If that's something you're dealing with your vision, of course getting some therapy for that is going to help. So that I thank you very much, Jenny, for mentioning that. So my son just practiced. He used handwriting without tears approach and just literally sat and practiced, and Denialian cursive writing, that was the other one. So he learned to write in print and cursive. Now here's something really crazy about that. He actually one day I was wandering through the living room, and he's my kid whose stuff just gets laid. It's all over the house. Like he never, I say he's like Pigpen. There's just a trail behind him. And one of the trails was some papers that he had been working on for his computer science class. This handwriting was exquisite, perfect. Every character so legible. I was like, wow. So when it's in an area he's interested in, he is very neat and careful and precise. But when it's something he doesn't care so much about, then it's not as neat and precise. So that's something to keep in mind too. I've seen that in kids besides just him. So, all right.
So it looks like that's all the questions. One of the things I wanted to add on the penmanship that we offer or talk to kids about is, if they're trying to write, I don't want to use the word cursive because it's like an old fashioned word, but if they're sort of scribbling along, sometimes if you change to have them write in all caps, it makes them go slower and then allows them to actually write more neatly. So that's something that we try to. So that's something you could use if the penmanship is pretty bad. See if you can change how they're approaching the writing, because it will slow them down. And sometimes kids actually like how they are placing it on the page and just end up going that route. We have lots of folks that have just changed over to literally just writing in all caps, small caps, I call it. So just one little suggestion. Sarah, you have been wonderful, and thank you so much for the fabulous presentation.
You're
I hope
welcome.
everyone that you have all found that Dr. Wayland's presentation was helpful for you and your child. You can reach Dr. Wayland via her website at www.guidingexceptionalparents.com. Again, that's www.guidingexceptionalparents.com. Or you can email her at Wayland, her last name, at guidingexceptionalparents.com. So please feel free to reach out to her. I'm sure she would love to get back to you or point you in the right direction of where you could get an answer if she can't give it to you. And she's a great resource to have. So we're very grateful that she could spend our time with us today. Want to also thank you guys all for joining. I think that people are probably hopping off, so I'll do this pretty quickly, but we understand that your time is valuable and limited, and we appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us today. So thank you very much for giving that compliment of giving us your time. As a reminder, this presentation has been recorded and you'll be able to access it next week on our website. Our website again is illuminos.co, not .com. And if you click parent resources, you'll have access to all of our webinars. I will re-record the introduction that we didn't quite catch, so everyone knows who they're seeing and the background information on Dr. Wayland. If your child needs support with executive functioning skills, feel free to reach out to us. You can send us an email at hello@illuminos.co, or you can just go to the Illuminos website and click learn more. And we offer free consultations to everyone. And we will talk to every family and see if it's a good fit. So we're here to help too. But I hope you guys all enjoyed the presentation and found it useful. You can also follow us on social media if you would like to see when our next great speaker is going to be on. Again, we just host these to bring you folks in that can support you guys. And so you can follow us on social media for that. And also we try to provide other information. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Wayland, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful rest of your week.